April 18th, 1943. Over the vast blue emptiness of the South Pacific, a single decision would change the course of the war. When one pilot used an illegal fuel mixture, until Isoroku Yamamoto fell, what really happened in those final moments? The mission began in the early hours from the remote American airstrip at Guadalcanal. 16 long-range fighters from the U.S. Army Air Forces prepared for a journey no fighter had ever completed under combat conditions. Their target was not a base, not a fleet, but a man. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, was flying a routine inspection tour. His route, his schedule, even his aircraft type, all had been uncovered through code breaking. But reaching him would require a flight of over 400 miles across open ocean, far beyond the safe operational limits of their aircraft. To make it there and back, some pilots would rely on something not entirely authorized, something that pushed their engines and their lives to the very edge. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point. The brutal fighting across the Solomon Islands had exhausted both sides. American forces had secured Guadalcanal, but the Japanese Empire remained formidable, entrenched across a vast defensive perimeter. At the center of Japan's naval strategy stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist, a cautious realist, a man who had warned Japan's leadership that war with the United States would be long and dangerous. Yet it was Yamamoto who had planned and executed the strike on Pearl Harbor, an attack that had awakened an industrial giant. Now, American intelligence had intercepted a critical communication. Through the efforts of U.S. Navy codebreakers working under the classified program known as Operation Magic, Yamamoto's travel itinerary had been decoded in full detail. He would depart from Rabaul, fly to the island of Bougainville, and conduct an inspection tour of forward units. The opportunity was unprecedented, but so was the risk. President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the mission personally. The objective was clear: intercept and eliminate Yamamoto. The responsibility fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group. Their aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was one of the few capable of long-range flight. But even the P-38 would struggle to cover the 600-mile round trip required to intercept Yamamoto's flight path. To succeed, everything would have to go perfectly. Fuel consumption, navigation, timing, and perhaps a little rule bending. At 0700 hours on April 18th, the pilots assembled for their final briefing. Maps were spread across wooden tables, coordinates marked with precision, every minute of the mission calculated down to the second. They would fly at low altitude, just 50 feet above the ocean, to avoid detection by Japanese radar. The formation would consist of 18 aircraft, 4 designated as the killer group. The rest would provide top cover. Among the pilots was Captain Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. and Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, both experienced aviators. But there was a problem: the distance. Even with drop tanks, the mission pushed the limits of the P-38's endurance. Any deviation, any delay, could mean running out of fuel over open ocean. Some ground crews, understanding the stakes, began making quiet adjustments. Fuel mixtures were tweaked, engine settings pushed beyond standard recommendations, higher manifold pressures, leaner fuel burn rates. Technically, unauthorized. In some cases, outright illegal under standard operating procedures. But this was no standard mission. By 0730 hours, the engines roared to life. One by one, the P-38s lifted off from Guadalcanal, climbing briefly before descending to wave-top height. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead. For the next 2 hours, they flew in near silence. No radio chatter, no navigation aids beyond dead reckoning and stopwatch timing. Every pilot watched the horizon and their fuel gauges. By 0900 hours, they were deep into enemy-controlled territory. Any sighting could trigger interception. Yet the sky remained empty. At 0934 hours, precisely on schedule, the formation approached the interception point near Bougainville. The timing had to be exact. Yamamoto's aircraft was expected at 0935. If they were early, they would miss him. If they were late, the opportunity would be gone forever. Fuel levels were already dangerously low. Some pilots had begun to worry. Had they miscalculated? Had the fuel mixture adjustments pushed too far? Then, at 0934 hours, movement on the horizon. 2 twin-engine bombers, escorted by 6 fighter aircraft. The formation matched the intelligence perfectly. This was it. The lead P-38s climbed sharply from their low-level approach, engines straining under the sudden demand for power. The Japanese escort, Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, reacted immediately, diving to intercept. The sky erupted into chaos. Machine guns thundered. Tracers streaked through the air. Captain Lanfear broke formation, engaging the escort fighters head-on. Lieutenant Barber pressed forward, targeting the bombers. One of those bombers carried Admiral Yamamoto. The distance closed rapidly. Just 200 yards. Then 100. Barber opened fire. The 50 caliber machine guns of his P-38 tore into the lead bomber, identified as a Mitsubishi G4M. The aircraft shuddered under the impact. Smoke began to pour from its engines. But the Japanese pilots fought back. Zero fighters swarmed the American formation, forcing them into defensive maneuvers. Fuel gauges dipped dangerously close to empty. Every second in the fight brought them closer to disaster. Barber stayed on target. He adjusted his aim, firing another burst. The bomber began to descend, trailing thick black smoke. Inside, Yamamoto sat calmly, reportedly composed even in those final moments. Moments later, the aircraft plunged into the dense jungle below. The second bomber attempted to escape, but was also attacked and forced down. The mission objective had been achieved, but the danger was far from over. With fuel nearly exhausted, the American pilots now faced a new crisis. They were deep in enemy territory. Their reserves, already stretched beyond safe limits, were almost gone. This was where the earlier illegal fuel adjustments proved critical. The modified fuel mixtures had extended their range, just enough. Pilots who had leaned their engines carefully found themselves with precious extra minutes of flight time. Others were not so fortunate. Some P-38s began to sputter as fuel ran dry. Pilots were forced to glide toward the ocean or search desperately for any friendly territory. Barber himself nursed his aircraft back toward Guadalcanal, constantly watching the gauges. The engines coughed, faltered, but held. One by one, the surviving aircraft limped back to base. Out of the original formation, several were lost, not to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion. The margin for success had been razor thin. Without those extra miles, those unauthorized adjustments, the mission might have failed. The wreckage of Yamamoto's aircraft was later discovered in the jungles of Bougainville. His body was found still strapped into his seat, wearing white gloves, his katana at his side. The news of his death was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. For the United States, it was a strategic and symbolic victory. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor had been eliminated. But the mission remained classified for months. Revealing it too soon would have exposed the Allies' code-breaking capabilities. The pilots involved received recognition, though controversy later emerged over who fired the fatal shots. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber was ultimately credited with the kill, though debates persisted for years. Medals were awarded, histories were written. But among those who flew the mission, one truth remained clear. They had succeeded, not just through skill and courage, but through decisions made in the margins. Decisions that bent the rules. Decisions that pushed machines and men beyond their limits. Against impossible odds, they had changed history. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.